So one of the struggles preparing for a intense job interview is how do you polish up your answers? How do you sharpen them? So that's why in today's video I'm going to give you 5 areas where you'd want to look at improving the quality of your answers. The first thing I want to touch upon here is the stories preparation. So it's a fact that the best way to communicate the best way to prepare to communicate for a job interview is to prepare stories. In other words, you prepare your successes, your highlights from your career, but you should also prepare a couple of failures or negative experiences, simply because these are often used to better screen you on these on your abilities and your behaviors. Now, how many stories do you want to prepare very much depends on the type of interview you're preparing for. In other words, a first or second phone interview round, or a on-site interview, or the seniority of your role. To give you some reference points, the more junior roles preparing for a phone interview would only have to prepare, let's say, 5 stories, maybe 4 successes and 1 failure. Whereas for more senior roles, going through a full on-site interview, let's say with 6 rounds, I would say you must get closer to 20 stories, 20 positively framed, and maybe 3 to 5 failure stories. I wouldn't recommend you to go beyond the 25 stories limit, because it becomes impossible to memorize them, and even more importantly, it becomes impossible to always remember the best possible story you'd want to use for the question you're getting asked. So I would say that would definitely be the upper limit. Now, all right, so this would be the stories should be the bread and butter of your communication strategy, of the answers you're going to give. You should also write down those stories. You should essentially have a brain dump in a day or two, and essentially ensure that you have these stories well written and well designed at first. Now, the second area you would want to keep in mind here are actually some housekeeping items with respect to these stories. The first one is an expression: stories sell, but numbers tell. So you should sell yourself in an interview, and the best way to sell yourself is through stories. But the numbers are also a very important aspect of this information, especially if you're applying for a high-performing company, Amazon, Facebook, Google, or Apple, for example. So ensure that you have quantifiable information, and quantifiable information is especially hard to have if your story is more ambiguous, or if you're talking about a failure. But nevertheless, still a very important topic here. The other housekeeping item I want to talk about here is to be positive. Even use humor if possible, if you feel like the story gets boring. Being positive is actually will ensure that your communication, your information will be well received, and over negativity is definitely a disqualifier, especially in the filtering rounds of interviewing with pretty much any company. So if in a phone interview you sound overly negative, that's definitely something that it is not a good sign at all. And last but not least, do not blame anyone. Like, why did you leave your last role? Most of people who left their roles didn't like their managers. So nevertheless, you should never say this in a job interview. You should never put your previous or your existing employer in a bad light, simply because that will be an indication that you might do the same with your future employer, or the one you're interviewing with. So this would be the housekeeping items that you want to keep in mind within your stories. Number 3. Now, I'm very much against memorizing answers to any questions. However, I believe that you are employing a good strategy if you memorize the ideas, the key statements in your stories. So in other words, when you have that brain dump that I talked about in the beginning of this video, if you structure those stories in key statements, and you do memorize those key statements and a couple of numbers that you probably don't even have to memorize, because you will probably remember them if you read them a couple of times, I believe your communication will be a little bit more structured. and if it's more structured and if you know what to say, then that will be a great skeleton for you to add on during the heat of the interview, and essentially to adapt your performance during the interview given that skeleton. So that skeleton would ensure that basically you're following, I don't know, the STAR format and whatever other format you would want to employ. But essentially, if you know that you're going to communicate everything you must communicate and you have it all at hand, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to beautify that answer in a way, if that's a word in English. Next, number 4 here. Remember the 4 C's of communication if you want. This is, to help you to tune up your answers while communicating them, not on paper, right? So while when you communicate your answers, when you communicate the idea that you want to transmit, keep in mind these 4 C's. Keep it clear. Your answer should be clear. Your answer should be coherent. Your answer should be complete. And your answer should be concise. Right? So clear, coherent, complete, and concise. So it's this is something you'll get used with as you practice, and this actually brings me to the last point of this list of tips to sharpen your answers, and that is to rehearse. So no one is born as a natural interviewer. Everyone has to rehearse. Everyone has to practice in order to become better with these things. Now, how can you rehearse? Well, the simplest way to do it is in the mirror, or you can also record yourself if you want, or you can do it with a friend or with multiple friends, or if you want, I also have a free role-play service you may want to consider using. But the rehearsal step is extremely important, and I would say that you would want to rehearse in multiple ways in order to ensure that you have the best possible feedback here, because a common pitfall of an interviewee is to fail to properly self-assess going into a job interview. This would be one thing, and on the other extreme, you must also avoid discouraging yourself. Right? So if you interview with someone that gives you too critical of feedback, then probably you will go discouraged into interview, and that's not going to be, again, to your advantage. So when you sharpen your answers, you must get, in a way in the zone, but stay in your comfort zone. Don't get out of your comfort zone, I don't know, a few hours before the interview, just for the sake of polishing up your answers. So keep this dimension in mind, so you maybe avoid also the probability of getting blocked, because simply you want to be a perfectionist with these things. But these would be the main elements you would want to keep in mind to properly sharpen your answers and essentially become better with interviewing, both with a phone, but especially maybe with an on-site interview.